What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another Introduction to Python tutorial. Today we're talking about functions. So what exactly are functions? Well, let's say you have a very complex program where you've written out a sequence of instructions, essentially code, and you're going to be using that code a bunch of times throughout your program. Well, you don't want to necessarily have to copy paste or retype that code throughout your program, and you can't just use a loop because the situation does not call for that. The sequence of instructions is scattered all throughout the program and not all in one place. And so one thing we can do is we can write a function. And so a function essentially stores a sequence of instructions, and when you call upon it, and you can call upon it whenever, wherever, and however, and when you do that, you essentially use those sequence of instructions. So without further ado, let's learn how to write functions. The notation is fairly simple. Let's just start with a function that will print hi. Let's go with that. So in order to write that function, we're going to need the word, we're going to need this keyword, and then we're going to need to name the function. So we're going to say hi printer, and then we'll put two parentheses, the colon, and we'll go to the next line. Remember that indentation is important. Then we can just say something like print, and then hi. Now this should do the trick. If we go over here and we call hi printer, and the way we call a function, essentially the way we activate it or tell it to run real quick, is we just say hi printer, the name of the function, and then these two parentheses. And so when we run our program, we should see down here at the bottom, we still have our stuff from the last loops tutorial, we get hi, just like that, alright? And so if we can call this function as many times as we want, we can call it again and again and again, and we can get a bunch of highs. And as we should see, we get a ton of highs, just like that. So essentially, sometimes a more advanced function might require some form of an input. And I say input, it's not exactly input. At least it's not the kind of input we talked about a couple tutorials ago. This input isn't coming from a user who is using the program that you've created. Instead, it's coming from a programmer who is implementing the function that you created. So with that knowledge, let's go ahead and try and program one of these more advanced functions. So let's just start a new function. I'm going to use the regular old syntax. And let's just set up the basis, and then we can add the fun stuff later. So I'm going to name mine multiply by 5. I'm going to put my parentheses in here, my colon, and I have my indentation already. Okay, so my goal for this function is for it to multiply whatever I give it by 5. And so in order to be able to do that, we're going to need to have to give our function some sort of a variable. And so let's name that variable num. And then num, if you don't know already, num is short for number. Probably should have specified that earlier in the series, but here we are. I guess you know now. So we're gonna name that num, and so we're gonna need a parameter num, and then down here we're going to say num equals num times 5, and so we're telling the computer, okay, calculate what is our original value that we were provided with times 5. And then we're going to use something new that you've not seen before, and that is the return keyword. We're going to say return num. All right, so what is return? It looks a bit strange. And if you see my Java tutorials, you will recognize this, no doubt. But essentially, when we call a function, a return, when we have a return statement at the bottom of our function, whoever called the function receives this value. And that sounds a little bit complicated, and that phrasing might be confusing. So let's just see this in action, and trust me, it'll make so much more sense. So if we create a number, and we say number equals 10, right? So we have this number variable, and now we want to call the multiply by 5 on this variable. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to write multiply by 5. And then we put in the variable that we want to run the function on. Because since this is an integer variable, and since this is an integer variable, they are compatible. So I can put number in place of num. So that is completely legal. And so now we have this function that is multiplied by 5 with a parameter of number, and number is equal to 10. And so when this is called, what should occur is the computer will go in here. It'll say, okay, number equals number times 5, so it's going to return 50. And then when the computer returns 50, it's going to take this line right here, or this segment, whatever called it, which is this right here, this bit of code, and it's just going to replace it with 50. And so right now, the computer, just running this code, the computer would do this calculation and return the number correctly. We wouldn't have any problems, but you wouldn't, store it or be able to see it. If we wanted to store it, we could just create another number. So we can call the number multiplied, and then we can set it equal to that. Or another thing we could do is we could just print. We could print that this. We could print this right here, or we could just print the variable we just created, which I see is a lot simpler. So they're simpler. Multiply. And that should do the trick. As we hit run and see that work. There's some code from our previous tutorials again. And there we go, right there at the very bottom. We have that 50, and that 50 comes from our function right here, our more advanced function, which has a argument of a integer value, which this is just a placeholder right here, a num variable, and then whatever is inputted is multiplied by 5, and then returned to the line of code that called this function. And so over here, where we call this function, this whole segment is replaced by what is returned. And in this case, what is returned is 50. If we change this to 5, we should see that the whole thing returns only 25, because 5 times 5 is 25. And there we go. So there you have it. You can do a lot of really cool things with functions. In fact, just for fun, let's go over one more pretty neat thing that can be done with functions. Although it seems counterintuitive, you can actually call a function from within a function. So instead of using a loop, you can actually just use the definition of a function, I guess kind of against itself, in order to create, I guess, a false kind of loop. It's an interesting thing, but it is pretty useful. So let's go ahead and talk about that. And so let's say, how do we want to do this? Let's create our function, and we're gonna say def, and then we're gonna go int. Or sorry, no, not second. We're gonna call this looper. Just for fun, we're gonna call our function looper because it loops around itself. We're gonna give it an input value of let's just come with an integer variable called num. There we go. That should do the trick. We put our colon in there. Move on to the next thing, and then we say num equals num plus 1. And then here's the interesting part. We say what we can say is that if num not if num is equal to, so let's go 50. Sorry guys, I'm kind of figuring this out on the fly, so it seems a bit jolly, but you can put a not out here. And so essentially what we're saying right here is if the number is not equal to 50, proceed with whatever is inside this if statement. However, if the number is equal to 50, whatever is inside the if statement will not run. And so what we can do now is we can actually call the function inside this if statement, which sounds kind of confusing. I mean, you're calling the function inside its own definition. That's true, but it works in programming language. So just bear with me. We'll see in a second. So what we can do is we can write something like call looper. So we can call looper, and then we can put num in as our argument. And so that should do the trick for now. We can always test this, but essentially we've created a function which will take a argument of some sort of a number. It will add 1 to that number, and then oh, we forgot something important. We should probably print the number, just so we can see things, because visibility when testing is important. And then we have this is statement, and if the number is not equal to 50, then the function will run itself again inside its own definition. But keep in mind, once the number finally hits 50, that is assuming that our number that we inputted started below 50 to begin with, this will not run, and as such, the definition of the function will essentially end there. So if we input a number lower than 50, we should not see an infinite loop, but instead we should see the function repeat until the value of num is equivalent to 50. So let's go ahead and give that a shot. We can go ahead and type. And also one thing to note is, although we have this thing set up for looping, it's not going to automatically run. So we must, in fact, call the function if we want that loop to occur. So I need to say looper, just as you might have expected, and then let's just put in 0 for fun. And we can go ahead and give that a go. And so we can set up our last run and start the next one. Here's all our code from last round, and right here you can see it. This was what we did a couple minutes ago, and then here is looper. And you'd think, wow, someone must have used probably a for loop or maybe even a while loop to repeat a print statement that printed out a number. But in fact, no loops were used in the creation of this code right here. It was all just the work of a function and calling that function within its own definition. So that's just a powerful thing you can do with functions, and now you know. That pretty much brings this Introduction to Python tutorial series to a close, at least for now. Look out for future videos and additional tutorial series. I really appreciate you guys watching, and I hope that you now have the skills necessary to develop some pretty awesome Python programs. Good job getting started with the language and taking the first steps towards becoming a programmer.